The morning sun cast long shadows across Camp Liberty as Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her body armor for what she thought would be another routine patrol. At 28, she had already served 3 tours in Afghanistan, but something about this day felt different. The air was thick with tension, and even the local birds seemed quieter than usual. Maria had grown up in a small Texas border town where her father worked as a border patrol agent and her mother as a school nurse. From childhood, she understood the weight of protecting others. Her parents had instilled in her a deep sense of duty and an unwavering moral compass that would guide her through the darkest moments ahead. Colonel James Mitchell, her commanding officer, was preparing for an important mission to deliver medical supplies to a remote village that had been cut off from aid for weeks. The intelligence report suggested the route was relatively safe, but Maria's instincts told her otherwise. She had learned to trust her gut feelings during her years of service, and today that inner voice was practically shouting warnings. The convoy consisted of 4 armored vehicles carrying medical supplies, water purification tablets, and emergency food rations. Maria was assigned as the colonel's personal security detail, a role she took with absolute seriousness. Colonel Mitchell was not just her commanding officer. He was a man she deeply respected. He had earned the loyalty of every soldier under his command through his fairness, courage, and genuine care for his troops. As they loaded the vehicles, Maria noticed increased radio chatter from reconnaissance teams in the area. Reports of suspicious activity had been filtering in throughout the week, but nothing concrete enough to cancel the humanitarian mission. The village desperately needed the supplies, and Colonel Mitchell was determined not to let bureaucratic caution prevent them from helping civilians caught in the crossfire of conflict. Maria checked her equipment one final time. Her M4 carbine, extra ammunition, first aid kit, and communication gear. She had developed a ritual over the years, a methodical process that helped calm her nerves and ensure she was prepared for anything. Her fellow soldiers often joked about her thoroughness, but they also knew that Maria's attention to detail had saved lives on previous missions. The convoy departed at 800 hours, following a predetermined route through mountainous terrain that offered both protection and vulnerability. The narrow roads provided cover from distant observation, but also limited escape routes if they encountered trouble. Maria positioned herself in the lead vehicle with Colonel Mitchell, constantly scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. During the first hour of travel, everything seemed normal. Local farmers worked their fields, children played near small villages, and the usual sounds of rural life filled the air. But Maria's training had taught her that normalcy could be deceptive in conflict zones. She remained alert, her eyes constantly moving, searching for anything out of place. Colonel Mitchell used the travel time to review intelligence reports and coordinate with base camp. He was a hands-on leader who insisted on understanding every detail of operations under his command. Maria admired his dedication, but she also worried about his tendency to put himself at risk for the sake of his troops and the mission. As they approached a narrow mountain pass, Maria's radio crackled with an urgent message from their rear guard. A local informant had reported seeing armed fighters moving toward their route. The information was unconfirmed, but it was enough to put the entire convoy on high alert. Maria immediately advised Colonel Mitchell of the potential threat and suggested they consider an alternate route. The colonel weighed their options carefully. Taking an alternate route would add several hours to their journey and delay critical medical supplies from reaching people who desperately needed them. The village they were heading to had reported several cases of cholera, and every hour of delay could mean more lives lost. Against Maria's recommendation, he decided to proceed with extreme caution. Maria felt a knot forming in her stomach as they entered the mountain pass. The terrain was perfect for an ambush, with rocky outcroppings providing countless hiding places for potential attackers. She increased her vigilance, noting every shadow, every movement, every sound that seemed out of place. Her finger rested near the trigger of her weapon, ready to respond at the first sign of trouble. The other soldiers in the convoy shared her tension. Radio communications became more frequent as each vehicle reported their status and observations. The mood had shifted from routine confidence to professional wariness. Everyone understood that they were potentially entering a dangerous situation, but they also knew the importance of their humanitarian mission. As they reached the midpoint of the pass, Maria spotted something that made her blood run cold. A glint of metal from a rocky outcropping about 300 meters ahead caught her eye. It was just a brief reflection, but her experienced eye recognized it immediately as the scope of a rifle. She quickly grabbed her binoculars for a closer look, her heart rate increasing as she confirmed her worst fears. Armed fighters were positioned on both sides of the narrow pass, creating a deadly crossfire zone that the convoy was rapidly approaching. Maria estimated at least 8 to 10 enemy positions, all strategically placed to maximize casualties when they opened fire. The ambush was sophisticated and well-planned, suggesting that their mission had been compromised or that the enemy had been tracking their movements. Without hesitation, Maria grabbed her radio and shouted a warning to all vehicles in the convoy. Her voice was calm but urgent as she reported the enemy positions and ordered immediate evasive action. But even as she spoke, she realized they were already too deep into the kill zone to retreat safely. The narrow road behind them offered no protection, and turning around would expose them to even more concentrated fire. Colonel Mitchell immediately understood the gravity of the situation. His years of experience had taught him to trust his soldiers' instincts, especially someone as reliable as Sergeant Santos. He ordered the convoy to accelerate through the ambush zone while Maria coordinated defensive positions from each vehicle. The race against death was about to begin, and Maria knew that the next few minutes would determine whether they all made it home alive. The first shots rang out like thunder echoing through the mountain pass, shattering the morning calm and transforming the peaceful convoy into a desperate fight for survival. Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as bullets struck the armored plating of their vehicle with metallic pings that sent sparks flying in all directions. Her training kicked in immediately, every movement precise and purposeful as chaos erupted around them. Colonel Mitchell was shouting orders into his radio, trying to coordinate the convoy's response while Maria returned fire through her window. The enemy had chosen their position perfectly, creating a deadly funnel where the American vehicles had little room to maneuver. The narrow mountain road offered no escape routes, forcing the convoy to fight their way through the ambush rather than retreat to safety. Maria could see muzzle flashes from at least 12 different positions now, confirming that this was a well-planned and coordinated attack. The enemy fighters were using a combination of automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades, creating a wall of devastating firepower that threatened to destroy the entire convoy. She quickly assessed their tactical situation and realized they were facing a much larger force than initially estimated. The second vehicle in their convoy took a direct hit from an RPG, causing it to veer off the road and crash into a rocky outcropping. Maria watched in horror as smoke began pouring from the damaged vehicle, knowing that her fellow soldiers were trapped inside and needed immediate assistance. Without hesitation, she requested permission from Colonel Mitchell to provide aid to the wounded vehicle. Colonel Mitchell understood the tactical implications of their situation. Every second they remained stationary made them easier targets for the enemy fighters. But he also knew that abandoning wounded soldiers was not an option, regardless of the personal risk involved. He gave Maria permission to coordinate a rescue attempt while continuing to direct the overall defense of the convoy. Maria grabbed her medical kit and extra ammunition before preparing to leave the relative safety of their armored vehicle. She knew that crossing the open ground to reach the damaged vehicle would expose her to concentrated enemy fire, but her fellow soldiers needed help and time was running out. The smoke from the crashed vehicle was getting thicker, suggesting that a fire had started and could spread to the fuel tank at any moment. Before leaving cover, Maria coordinated with the other vehicles to provide suppressing fire that would give her the best chance of reaching the wounded soldiers alive. She studied the terrain carefully, identifying the fastest route that would minimize her exposure to enemy positions. Every detail mattered when crossing a kill zone under fire, and one wrong step could mean the difference between life and death. The moment she left the vehicle, Maria felt bullets whizzing past her head as enemy fighters concentrated their fire on her position. She sprinted across the rocky ground, using every available piece of cover while maintaining her direction toward the crashed vehicle. Her body armor absorbed at least 2 impacts, but she kept moving forward, driven by an unwavering determination to save her fellow soldiers. When she reached the damaged vehicle, Maria found 3 soldiers inside, 2 of whom were unconscious and bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds. The third soldier, Private Johnson, was alert, but trapped under twisted metal from the vehicle's damaged frame. He was trying to free himself while also applying pressure to his wounded leg. but the smoke was making it difficult to breathe and see clearly. Maria immediately began assessing the wounded soldiers while also monitoring the tactical situation around them. The enemy fire was intensifying, and she could hear Colonel Mitchell's voice on the radio, calling for air support and medical evacuation. But she knew that help would take time to arrive, and they needed to survive the immediate threat before rescue could reach them. Working with practiced efficiency, Maria began treating the most severely wounded soldier first. She applied pressure bandages to stop the bleeding while simultaneously helping Private Johnson free himself from the wreckage. The smoke was getting thicker, and she could smell fuel, indicating that the vehicle's tank had been punctured and posed an immediate explosion risk. Private Johnson refused to leave his unconscious comrades behind, demonstrating the loyalty and brotherhood that defined their unit. Maria respected his dedication, but also understood that they had only minutes before the vehicle became completely engulfed in flames. She made the difficult decision to focus on moving the unconscious soldiers first, knowing that Private Johnson could follow under his own power despite his injuries. As she dragged the first wounded soldier from the wreckage, Maria heard Colonel Mitchell's voice on her radio, reporting that enemy fighters were attempting to flank their position. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and she realized that their convoy was in danger of being completely overrun if they couldn't break contact soon. The rescue operation needed to be completed quickly so they could resume their fighting. Withdrawal. Maria signaled to the other vehicles for additional covering fire as she prepared to move the second unconscious soldier. The enemy had recognized her rescue attempt and was concentrating fire on the crashed vehicle, making each trip increasingly dangerous. Bullets struck the ground around her feet as she worked, but she remained focused on her mission to save every soldier under her care. Colonel Mitchell made the difficult decision to begin moving the convoy while Maria completed her rescue operation. He knew that staying in one position much longer would result in the complete destruction of their force, but he also refused to leave any soldier behind. He ordered the remaining vehicles to begin a fighting withdrawal while providing continuous covering fire for Maria's position. As the convoy began moving, Maria realized that she and the wounded soldiers were in danger of being left behind in enemy territory. The tactical situation required split-second decisions that could determine the survival of the entire unit. She quickly calculated the time needed to complete the rescue against the time the convoy could safely remain in position, knowing that someone's life would depend on her decision. Private Johnson, despite his own injuries, grabbed the medical kit and began helping Maria treat the unconscious soldiers. His determination to save his comrades inspired Maria and reminded her why she had chosen to serve in the military. Together they worked to stabilize the wounded while preparing for what might be their final stand against an overwhelming enemy force. The sound of approaching enemy fighters grew louder as Maria worked frantically to stabilize the wounded soldiers. She could hear boots scrambling over rocks and urgent voices calling out in a language she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. They were being surrounded. The enemy had recognized that the crashed vehicle contained trapped Americans and was moving to capture or eliminate them before the convoy could escape. Maria made a quick tactical assessment of their situation. The damaged vehicle provided some cover, but its position was exposed to fire from multiple directions. The fuel leak was getting worse, creating a growing pool of flammable liquid that could ignite at any moment. She had perhaps 2 minutes to get everyone to safety before their temporary shelter became a death trap. Private Johnson had managed to free himself from the wreckage and was now helping Maria move the unconscious soldiers. Despite his leg wound, he refused to slow down or complain about the pain. His determination reminded Maria of why she respected the soldiers under her command. They never abandoned each other, regardless of the personal cost. Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled over her radio with an urgent update. The convoy was taking heavy casualties and could not maintain their current position much longer. Air support was still 15 minutes away, and the enemy force was larger than initially estimated. He needed Maria and the wounded soldiers to reach the next defensive position within the next 3 minutes, or they would have to leave them behind to save the rest of the convoy. The weight of that deadline pressed down on Maria like a physical force. She knew that Colonel Mitchell was making an impossible decision based on military necessity, but she also knew that she would never abandon wounded soldiers. She quickly formulated a plan that might give them all a chance to survive, though it would require her to take enormous personal risks. Maria instructed Private Johnson to begin moving the unconscious soldiers toward the convoy's new position while she provided covering fire. She had identified the enemy positions that posed the greatest threat and planned to engage them directly, buying precious time for the wounded to reach safety. It was a dangerous plan that would expose her to concentrated enemy fire, but it was their only chance. As Private Johnson began dragging the first wounded soldier across the open ground, Maria opened fire on the nearest enemy position. Her accurate shooting forced the attackers to take cover, temporarily reducing the incoming fire. She moved quickly from position to position around the damaged vehicle, creating the illusion of a larger defensive force while actually fighting alone. The enemy fighters were experienced and quickly adapted to her tactics. They began concentrating their fire on her position, while also trying to flank around the crashed vehicle. Maria realized that her ammunition was running low, and that she could not maintain this level of suppressing fire much longer. She needed to make every shot count while also preparing for what might be a final defensive stand. Colonel Mitchell had moved his vehicle as close as possible to provide additional covering fire for the rescue operation. Despite the tactical risk to his own position, he refused to abandon his soldiers. His leadership inspired the entire convoy to fight with renewed determination. Even though they were heavily outnumbered and in an extremely vulnerable position, Maria heard the distinctive whistle of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade and threw herself behind the damaged vehicle. Just as the explosion shook the ground beneath her, shrapnel scattered in all directions, and she felt several pieces strike her body armor. The blast had been close enough to temporarily deafen her, but she quickly checked herself for injuries and continued fighting. Private Johnson had successfully moved the first wounded soldier to safety and was returning for the second when enemy fighters appeared on the ridge above their position. Maria engaged them immediately, her rifle fire forcing them to seek cover while Private Johnson completed his rescue mission. The tactical situation was becoming more desperate by the minute, but she refused to give up hope. The second wounded soldier was semi-conscious and able to help with his own movement, which significantly reduced the time needed to reach safety. Maria provided continuous covering fire while also monitoring her ammunition count. She had perhaps 30 rounds remaining, barely enough to cover Private Johnson's final trip to safety, let alone defend her own withdrawal. Colonel Mitchell's radio calls were becoming more urgent as the convoy's position became increasingly untenable. The enemy was bringing up reinforcements and heavier weapons that could destroy their armored vehicles. He needed to begin the final withdrawal immediately, but he also needed to ensure that Maria and the wounded soldiers could reach safety first. Maria made the decision that would define the rest of the engagement. She told Private Johnson to take the remaining wounded soldier and run for the convoy's position, while she remained behind to provide covering fire. She knew that this decision would likely cost her own life, but it would ensure that her fellow soldiers survived to return to their families. Private Johnson protested her decision, arguing that they should all withdraw together. But Maria's tone made it clear that this was not a discussion. It was an order. She reminded him of his duty to the wounded soldiers and to his own family back home. Sometimes, she explained, one person has to make the hard choice so that others can live. As Private Johnson began his final sprint towards safety, carrying the wounded soldier on his back, Maria engaged every enemy position she could identify. Her rifle fire was accurate and deadly, forcing the attackers to remain in cover while her comrades escaped. She knew that revealing her position so openly made her an easy target, but the lives of her fellow soldiers were worth any personal risk. The enemy fighters recognized that Maria was the key to the American defense and began concentrating their fire on her position. Bullets struck the damaged vehicle around her, and she could hear them calling to each other as they coordinated their attack. She was now facing at least 20 enemy fighters alone, with limited ammunition and no possibility of retreat. Colonel Mitchell watched through his binoculars as Maria made her stand, knowing that her sacrifice was saving the lives of his wounded soldiers. Her courage reminded him why he had chosen to serve in the military, and why soldiers like Maria Santos represented the very best of American values. He began planning his own response to ensure that her sacrifice would not be in vain. Colonel Mitchell watched through his scope as Maria continued her desperate fight against overwhelming odds. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, But she maintained disciplined fire, making every shot count while the enemy tightened their circle around her position. He knew that military protocol demanded he withdraw immediately to save the convoy. But everything in his moral fiber rebelled against leaving a soldier behind. The radio crackled with reports from other vehicles in the convoy. They were taking casualties and running low on ammunition themselves. The enemy had brought up mortars and was beginning to bracket their position with increasingly accurate fire. Time was running out for everyone, but Colonel Mitchell could not bring himself to give the order to abandon Maria Santos. Maria's rifle clicked empty, and she quickly reached for her sidearm while scanning the battlefield for any additional weapons. The damaged vehicle around her was riddled with bullet holes, and smoke from multiple fires was beginning to obscure her vision. She could hear enemy fighters calling to each other as they prepared for a final assault on her position. Knowing that she was nearly out of ammunition, in that moment of desperate need, Maria remembered the weapons and ammunition that had been stored in the crashed vehicle. Despite the fire and smoke, she crawled back into the wreckage and found an additional rifle and several magazines of ammunition. The metal was hot from the flames, but she grabbed the weapon anyway, ignoring the burns on her hands as she prepared for the next wave of enemy attacks. Colonel Mitchell made a decision that would define his career and his character. Instead of ordering a withdrawal, he called for volunteers to join him in a rescue mission to extract Sergeant Santos. Every soldier in the convoy immediately volunteered, despite the obvious risks involved. Their loyalty to Maria and to each other overcame any concern for personal safety. The rescue plan was simple but dangerous. 2 vehicles would provide covering fire, while Colonel Mitchell's vehicle raced across the open ground to reach Maria's position. The timing would have to be perfect, as they would only have one chance to reach her before the enemy realized what was happening and concentrated all their fire on the rescue vehicle. Maria saw Colonel Mitchell's vehicle breaking away from the convoy and immediately understood what he was attempting. She grabbed her radio and ordered him to return to the convoy, arguing that the mission was more important than one soldier's life. But Colonel Mitchell's response was firm and final. No soldier would be left behind on his watch, regardless of the consequences. The enemy fighters had begun their final assault on Maria's position when Colonel Mitchell's rescue attempt began. They were advancing from multiple directions, using grenades and automatic weapons to suppress her defensive fire. Maria knew that she had perhaps 60 seconds before they would overrun her position, making the timing of the rescue absolutely critical. Colonel Mitchell's driver pushed their armored vehicle to its maximum speed across the rocky terrain, while the colonel himself provided covering fire through the vehicle's gun port. Bullets struck their armor with increasing frequency as the enemy recognized the rescue attempt and tried to stop it. The vehicle's engine was hit several times, but it continued running despite the damage. Maria used her remaining ammunition to provide covering fire for the approaching rescue vehicle, targeting the enemy positions that posed the greatest threat to Colonel Mitchell's approach. Her accurate shooting forced several attackers to retreat, creating a brief window of opportunity for the rescue to succeed. But she could see more enemy fighters approaching from the flanks, threatening to surround both positions. The rescue vehicle skidded to a stop beside the crashed vehicle, just as Maria fired her last round. Colonel Mitchell leaped from the passenger seat and sprinted toward her position, while his driver maintained suppressing fire with the vehicle's mounted weapon. Enemy bullets were striking all around them as Maria abandoned her defensive position and ran toward the rescue vehicle. An enemy grenade exploded just meters from Maria and Colonel Mitchell as they reached the rescue vehicle. The blast knocked them both to the ground and left Maria temporarily stunned. Colonel Mitchell, despite being wounded himself by shrapnel, grabbed Maria and dragged her toward the vehicle while enemy fighters closed in from all sides. The driver of the rescue vehicle was wounded but continued operating the mounted weapon, providing crucial covering fire as Colonel Mitchell loaded Maria into the passenger compartment. Blood was streaming down his face from a head wound, but he refused to stop fighting until both he and Maria were safely inside the armored vehicle. As the rescue vehicle began its withdrawal, enemy fighters emerged from cover and gave chase, firing automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades at the fleeing Americans. The vehicle's rear armor was repeatedly struck, and several critical systems were damaged. But the engine continued running and the vehicle maintained its speed toward the convoy's position. Maria regained consciousness during the withdrawal and, immediately began treating Colonel Mitchell's wounds while also monitoring the tactical situation. Despite her own injuries and exhaustion, her first priority was the welfare of her commanding officer and the success of their escape. Her medical training proved invaluable as she worked to stop his bleeding while under fire. The convoy had repositioned to provide covering fire for the returning rescue vehicle, creating a corridor of suppressing fire that forced the pursuing enemy fighters to take cover. The coordination between all vehicles demonstrated the high level of training and unit cohesion that had been developed through months of combat operations. Together, Colonel Mitchell's rescue vehicle reached the convoy's new position just as air support finally arrived overhead. The sound of approaching helicopter gunships caused the enemy fighters to disperse and seek cover, ending the immediate threat to the American convoy. But the cost of the engagement had been severe, with multiple casualties and extensive damage to their vehicles and equipment. As medical personnel began treating the wounded, Maria insisted on helping with the other casualties before receiving treatment for her own injuries. Her dedication to her fellow soldiers, even after her own ordeal, exemplified the values that made her such a respected member of the unit. Colonel Mitchell watched her work and realized that her actions during the ambush had saved not only his life but the lives of every soldier in the convoy. The helicopter gunships provided escort as the convoy continued toward their original destination, determined to complete their humanitarian mission despite the enemy attack. The medical supplies they were carrying were desperately needed by civilian populations, and both Maria and Colonel Mitchell agreed that the mission should continue. Their sacrifice would be meaningless if they allowed the enemy to prevent them from helping innocent people caught in the conflict. The village they finally reached 3 hours later was a stark reminder of why their mission mattered so much. Children with hollow eyes and distended bellies gathered around the convoy, their desperate hope visible despite the language barrier. Maria watched from her stretcher as local medical workers began distributing the supplies that had cost so much blood to deliver, and she felt a deep sense of purpose that justified every risk they had taken. Colonel Mitchell, despite his own wounds, insisted on personally overseeing the distribution of medical supplies to ensure they reached the people who needed them most. His dedication to the humanitarian mission, even after the devastating ambush, inspired every soldier in the convoy and reinforced their commitment to helping innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of war. The village elder, a weathered man with kind eyes, approached Colonel Mitchell through an interpreter to express his gratitude for their sacrifice. He explained that the cholera outbreak had already claimed 12 lives, including several children, and that the medicine they brought would save dozens more. His words carried the weight of genuine appreciation that transcended cultural and language differences. Maria watched the medical distribution from her treatment area, where Army medics were cleaning and bandaging her wounds. Despite her exhaustion and pain, she felt a profound satisfaction knowing that their mission had succeeded. The image of children receiving life-saving medicine would stay with her for the rest of her life, a reminder that military service was ultimately about protecting those who could not protect themselves. The helicopter evacuation of the most seriously wounded soldiers began immediately, but Maria refused to leave until every other casualty had been treated and evacuated first. Her selflessness continued even after the battle, demonstrating the leadership qualities that had earned her the respect of every soldier in the unit. Colonel Mitchell made a mental note to ensure that her actions received proper recognition. News of the ambush and rescue operation spread quickly through military channels, reaching senior commanders who recognized the extraordinary heroism displayed by both Maria and Colonel Mitchell. Initial reports focused on the tactical aspects of the engagement, but soon the human story of sacrifice and loyalty began to emerge, capturing the attention of military leadership at the highest levels. Colonel Mitchell spent his recovery time writing detailed reports about the engagement, ensuring that Maria's actions were documented with precision and clarity. He knew that her heroism deserved formal recognition, but more importantly, he wanted her story to serve as an example for future generations of soldiers. Her willingness to risk everything for her fellow soldiers embodied the highest ideals of military service. The wounded soldiers who had been rescued by Maria's actions recovered successfully, and each one credited her with saving their lives. Private Johnson, whose leg wound had initially seemed minor, developed complications that could have been fatal without Maria's immediate medical intervention. The ripple effects of her actions extended far beyond the immediate battle, touching families and communities that never knew her name. Military investigators conducted extensive interviews with every survivor of the ambush, building a comprehensive picture of the engagement and the individual acts of heroism that had prevented a complete disaster. Maria's actions emerged as the pivotal factor that had saved the convoy, but she consistently deflected credit to her fellow soldiers and emphasized the team effort that had made survival possible. The story of the ambush reached the media through official military channels, but Maria was initially uncomfortable with the attention her actions received. She had joined the military to serve her country, not to become famous, and she worried that individual recognition might overshadow the contributions of her fellow soldiers. Her humility only increased the respect that others felt for her character and values. Colonel Mitchell recovered from his wounds and returned to active duty, but his perspective on leadership had been permanently changed by Maria's example. He began incorporating her story into leadership training programs, using her actions to illustrate the qualities that define exceptional soldiers. Her influence on military culture began spreading far beyond her immediate unit. The humanitarian mission that had cost so much to complete proved even more successful than originally hoped. The medical supplies prevented the cholera outbreak from spreading to neighboring villages, ultimately saving hundreds of lives. Local community leaders credited the American military sacrifice with preserving their way of life and protecting their children's future. Maria's family back in Texas learned about her heroism through official military channels, but they were not surprised by her actions. Her parents had raised her with values that emphasized service to others and courage in the face of adversity. Her father, the Border Patrol agent, said that Maria had always been willing to put herself at risk to help others, even as a child. The investigation into the ambush revealed that enemy forces had been tracking the convoy's movements for several days before the attack. The sophisticated planning and execution of the ambush indicated a high level of enemy capability, making the successful defense and rescue operation even more remarkable. Military planners began developing new security protocols based on lessons learned from the engagement. Maria's actions during the ambush became a case study in military academies, where future officers studied her decision-making process and tactical thinking under extreme pressure. Her ability to maintain focus and effectiveness while surrounded by chaos demonstrated the psychological resilience that military leaders hope to develop in all soldiers. The bonds forged during the ambush created lasting relationships among the survivors that would endure long after their military service ended. Private Johnson maintained regular contact with Maria, crediting her with not only saving his life but also inspiring him to pursue a career in emergency medicine. The shared experience of survival under fire created connections that transcended normal friendships. Colonel Mitchell recommended Maria for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration for valor in combat. The recommendation detailed every aspect of her heroic actions, from her initial warning about the ambush to her final stand that enabled the rescue of wounded soldiers. The formal recognition process would take months, but the impact of her actions was already being felt throughout the military. Military psychologists studied the ambush as an example of how training and unit cohesion could enable ordinary soldiers to perform extraordinary acts of heroism under pressure. Maria's actions demonstrated that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act decisively despite that fear. Her example became a standard for measuring heroic conduct in combat situations. 2 years after the ambush, Maria Santos stood in the rose garden of the White House wearing her dress blue uniform with hands that still bore faint scars from that terrible day. President Harris approached with the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, while Maria's parents watched with tears of pride streaming down their faces. The ceremony marked not just recognition of her heroism, but the beginning of changes that would reshape military culture for generations. Colonel Mitchell, now promoted to general, stood among the distinguished guests as he watched his former subordinate receive the recognition she so richly deserved. His own career had flourished partly because of the leadership lessons he had learned from Maria's example, and he had made it his mission to ensure that her story became part of official military doctrine on courage under fire, the Medal of Honor citation, Read aloud by the president detailed Maria's actions with precision, but the dry military language could barely capture the human drama of that day. Her willingness to sacrifice her own safety for wounded comrades had saved 4 lives directly and inspired defensive actions that prevented the complete destruction of the convoy. The ripple effects of her courage continued to spread through the military community. Maria's story had already transformed military training programs across all branches of service. New curricula emphasized not just tactical skills, but also the moral courage needed to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. Her actions during the ambush became a standard case study for developing the next generation of military leaders, both male and female. The recognition of Maria's heroism coincided with broader changes in how the military viewed women in combat roles. Her Medal of Honor helped dispel lingering doubts about women's ability to perform under the most extreme combat conditions, opening doors for thousands of female soldiers who would follow in her footsteps. Military policies regarding women in combat units were revised to reflect the reality that courage and competence knew no gender boundaries. Private Johnson, now Dr. Johnson, had completed medical school with assistance from the military's Educational Benefits Program. He credited Maria's life-saving actions with inspiring his career choice and had established a scholarship fund for children of military families affected by combat injuries. His success represented one of many lives that had been transformed by Maria's heroism on that mountain pass. The village where they had delivered medical supplies had erected a small monument honoring the American soldiers who had risked their lives to bring aid during their desperate time of need. Local children who had been saved by the medicine learned the story of Sergeant Santos and grew up understanding that courage could come from unexpected places. The humanitarian impact of their mission continued to resonate in the community. Maria had initially struggled with the attention her heroism received, preferring to credit her training and her fellow soldiers rather than accept individual recognition. But she gradually came to understand that her story served a larger purpose in inspiring others and honoring the memory of soldiers who had made similar sacrifices without recognition. Her humility only increased the respect others felt for her character. The psychological studies of the ambush had contributed to new understanding of how soldiers respond to extreme stress and make critical decisions under fire. Maria's ability to maintain tactical awareness while performing life-saving actions under intense enemy fire became a model for developing resilience training programs. Military psychologists used her experience to help other soldiers prepare for the mental challenges of combat. General Mitchell had incorporated Maria's story into his leadership philosophy, teaching young officers that true leadership meant being willing to sacrifice for subordinates rather than expecting subordinates to sacrifice for leaders. His command style, influenced by watching Maria's selfless actions, emphasized building the kind of unit cohesion that enabled extraordinary performance when lives were at stake. The families of the soldiers Maria had saved maintained close relationships with her, considering her an honorary member of their extended families. Annual reunions brought together all the survivors of the ambush, creating a support network that helped everyone process the trauma they had experienced. These gatherings reinforced the bonds forged in combat and provided ongoing healing for psychological wounds. Maria's hometown in Texas had renamed a street in her honor, and the local high school had established a junior ROTC program that emphasized leadership and service to others. Young people who grew up hearing her story were inspired to consider military service and public service careers, multiplying the impact of her example across generations. Her influence extended far beyond the military community. The tactical innovations developed in response to the ambush had been implemented throughout the military, improving convoy security and reducing casualties in similar situations. Maria's early warning about the enemy positions had been recognized as crucial to the convoy's survival, leading to enhanced training for soldiers in reconnaissance and threat recognition. Her military expertise had contributed to saving lives beyond her immediate actions. Military historians studying the engagement placed it in the context of other Medal of Honor actions, noting that Maria's sustained courage over an extended period distinguished her heroism from momentary acts of bravery. Her ability to perform multiple life-saving actions while under continuous enemy fire demonstrated a level of sustained valor that was rare even among Medal of Honor recipients. The documentary film about the ambush had won several awards, and was used in military academies worldwide to teach leadership and heroism under fire. Maria had reluctantly participated in the interviews, but her authentic voice and genuine emotion had made the film a powerful tool for inspiring future soldiers. The proceeds from the documentary were donated to charities supporting wounded veterans and their families. Maria's transition back to civilian life had been challenging, as many veterans experienced difficulty adjusting after intense combat experiences. But her strong support network of fellow survivors and her commitment to helping other veterans had provided purpose and direction during the adjustment period. She eventually found fulfilling work as a counselor, helping other veterans process their combat experiences and reintegrate into civilian society. The scholarship program established in Maria's name had already helped dozens of military children attend college, creating educational opportunities that might not have existed otherwise. The program specifically targeted children from families affected by combat casualties, ensuring that the sacrifices of military families contributed to positive outcomes for future generations. Maria personally mentored several scholarship recipients, sharing lessons about perseverance and service. General Mitchell's final assignment before retirement was overseeing the development of new military leadership doctrine that incorporated lessons learned from Maria's actions and similar acts of heroism. His work ensured that her example would become part of the official curriculum for training future military leaders, institutionalizing the values she had demonstrated during the ambush. Her influence on military culture had become permanent and far-reaching. The village elder who had thanked them for their sacrifice had passed away, but his grandson maintained correspondence with Maria, updating her on the community's progress and the children who had been saved by their mission. The medical supplies they had delivered had prevented a humanitarian disaster, and the village had prospered in the years since. Their sacrifice had created lasting positive change in the lives of people they barely knew. Maria's parents had become advocates for military families, using their daughter's recognition to draw attention to the needs of soldiers and their loved ones. They spoke at military events and community gatherings, sharing Maria's story, while also highlighting the contributions of countless other soldiers whose heroism might never receive public recognition. Their advocacy work honored all military families, not just their own. The changes in military culture initiated by Maria's example had created opportunities for a new generation of female soldiers who no longer faced questions about their ability to serve in combat roles. Young women entering the military could look to her Medal of Honor as proof that courage and competence were the only qualifications that mattered in service to their country. Her legacy had opened doors that might have remained closed for decades. 20 years after the ambush, Maria stood before a new group of soldiers at Fort Benning, sharing her story and the lessons she had learned about leadership, sacrifice, and service. Her gray hair and weathered face showed the passage of time, but her voice remained strong as she emphasized that heroism was not about seeking recognition, but about doing what was right when others needed help. The young soldiers listened with rapt attention to a living legend who had changed military history. The mountain pass where the ambush had occurred had been secured and was now used as a training site for convoy operations. A small plaque marked the location where Maria had made her stand, serving as a reminder to future soldiers about the courage that ordinary people could display under extraordinary circumstances. The site had become a pilgrimage destination for military personnel, who wanted to honor her memory and draw inspiration from her example. Maria's story continued to inspire people far beyond the military community, reaching teachers, police officers, firefighters, and other public servants who faced their own moments of crisis and decision. Her example demonstrated that heroism was not limited to combat situations, but could emerge whenever someone chose to put others' welfare above their own safety. Her influence had transcended military boundaries to touch civilian life as well. The final legacy of that terrible day in the mountain pass was not just the lives saved or the recognition earned, but the transformation of an entire institution's understanding of courage, leadership, and sacrifice. Maria Santos had shown that heroism was not about superhuman abilities but about training, character, and the willingness to act when action was needed most. Her story would continue inspiring future generations long after she was gone, proving that one person's courage could indeed change everything.